I have no delusions that Putin dying, it isn't going to fix an authoritarian system that has been put in place over decades. That honestly, the democratic experiment in Russia has failed from the start. We know he's been isolating himself. We know from the way he's been running PR events. We know from the way he's been communicating with foreign politicians that he has been isolating himself. Those are all signs of, yeah, we don't know what happens after Putin. Like, for all we know, Lavrov could take over. So, according to a US intelligence report, Putin has been treated for cancer in April. No offense to Ukrainian intelligence, but this is another level of source when it comes to those kinds of things. Seems to have reemerged after undergoing treatment in April for advanced cancer. 3 US intelligence leaders who have read the reports tell Newsweek. They claim it's advanced cancer, whatever the hell that means. So the high-ranking officials are concerned that Putin is increasingly paranoid about his hold on power. However, they caution that the Russian leader's isolation makes it more difficult to precisely assess Putin's status and health. They don't claim that they have a really clear picture of his health situation. What we know is that there is an iceberg out there, albeit one covered in fog, says the DNI leader. One source of our best intelligence, which is contact with outsiders, largely dried up as a result of the Ukraine war, says the DIA senior official. Putin has had few meetings with foreign leaders, which, well, we know that is true. We don't have the report either, so we don't know what evidence is being used here. However, what evidence they are pointing out in this article is very, very vague. When meeting with Shoigu, Putin had been absent for most of the month, and he was far from a picture of health, slouching in his chair and gripping the table with his right hand. Some observers inferred that he had Parkinson's disease. Others insisted that it was just KGB weapons training, referring to his rigid stance to walk, etc., etc. Putin not having many meetings can also be because of Ukraine. Well, yes and no. You would expect him to be present when it comes to diplomatic meetings, though you could argue that he doesn't take those seriously, which... and the Kremlin hasn't been taking those very seriously. Some of the evidence they've used a bit later in this article, Putin has been in contact, like a video conference. This Monday, Putin had a phone call with Turkish President Erdogan, where the two discussed the possibility of a face-to-face meeting with Zelensky. So maybe we will actually see a face-to-face meeting. Zelensky, Putin, Erdogan being the moderator, something like that could happen. But yeah, the long table when meeting with Macron, most analysts seem to agree that it was about COVID. It was about isolating himself from close contact with other people. Could also be about keeping foreign observers, even if it's Macron, far away from him, I guess is kind of the argument here. Is Putin sick? Absolutely, but we shouldn't let waiting for his death drive proactive actions on our part. A power vacuum after Putin could be very dangerous for the world. Apart from the speculation on whether Putin is actually sick or not, what this article actually goes into, which is kind of important, that doesn't really change the situation regardless. First off, something they don't mention in the article is he's going to get cutting-edge, world-class healthcare. He's gonna get world-class treatment. The cancer would need to be really fucking severe to actually kill him. The treatment would have to fail. Very unlikely to elaborate any kind of strategy where you're basically just waiting for him to die. That seems unrealistic. Secondly, we've already seen problems when foreign officials, like when Biden or I forgot that other person's name, start wishing for Putin to be deposed or to die, or well, to be out of power. I personally, and the article agrees with me, we don't actually want to make the Kremlin think that we want to interfere in their politics. Even if we do want to interfere in their politics, I think it's okay to be dishonest about it. Everyone knows we wish he would fucking die and be replaced. Obviously, he would be replaced by, you know, another psycho, but hopefully a psycho who will look at the situation and be like, hey, maybe I can press the reset button on this, you know? Get out of the war, sign a compromise, be like a new start, a new beginning, sign some treaties with the West, give peace a chance. Maybe it's Copium, but that's what I'm hoping for in those kinds of situations. Well, they said advanced cancer, which basically means you're dead, kiddo. Maybe. We don't know, Roserg. That's the thing. They speculate it's advanced cancer. It's not like the CIA has actually infiltrated the Kremlin's closest circles or like Moscow's hospital where Putin is being treated. Lavrov dismissed any notion of Putin being sick in an interview on French TV last week. I don't think that a sane person can suspect any signs of illness or ailment in this man, Lavrov said. That doesn't mean anything, it's Lavrov. Basically, the thing I'm trying to say, and the thing this article is trying to say as well, is don't huff the copium too hard either. Just because we want this to be true, just because we want this to mean something, doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but most importantly, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. We've seen this go around for quite a while, the speculation that Putin is sick, ever since the start of the war. I haven't really dealt with the speculation in my reports on Ukraine, because to me, it almost always felt like copium. It was like, hey, look at how Putin is holding this table, how he's walking, he looks bloated. Like, sure, you can infer things from that, from like his appearance on TV, but can you come to conclusions from that? Probably not. So it always felt like, or like people are really going hard on the copium in those speculations. The reason why I'm covering it now, US intelligence is now jumping onto the bandwagon of Putin actually is very sick. How would I feel about it if he actually did? If he actually had cancer, it would depend on how serious the cancer is. Maybe then there is a timeline for a change in government in the Kremlin. I have no delusions that Putin dying, it isn't going to fix an authoritarian system that has been put in place over decades. That honestly, the democratic experiment in Russia has failed from the start, according to many articles and historians. But I forgot the name of the first president. Even he was very far from being an actual good democratic influence on the society and on the government. And Putin is, to those analysts, to those historians, is just a continuation of what started back then. More power to the oligarchs, more power to the close-knit circle of like ex-KGB organized political crime, basically, people. When I say organized political crime, it's because that is the start of Putin's career. Putin started off embezzling funds as what was it, in St. Petersburg or I think it was St. Petersburg's mayoral office in the 90s. He was very clearly involved in embezzling millions and millions. The thing that Putin did that was very smart, he was like, that's why I'm saying Russia actually never was a proper democracy. Putin played his cards well in that he was embezzling money under the mentorship and support of other more prominent politicians. So when journalists started trying to investigate Putin's shit, they ran into roadblocks really fast. Even if Putin wasn't yet in power and wasn't yet able to disappear them, it was none of that led anywhere, really. The only places you're going to hear about it is in Western media, and well, that doesn't have much of an effect on internal Russian politics at this point. Yeah, we don't know what happens after Putin. Like, for all we know, Lavrov could take over, or Shoigu, or... Okay, if we trust all those reports, which is a decently big if, Putin has been behaving more and more paranoid, and this is like the paranoia part of the reports is something I actually personally would think is a very reliable assessment. We've seen all the memes about the super long table, how far he stands from other people. We know he's been isolating himself. We know from the way he's been running PR events. We know from the way he's been communicating with foreign politicians that he has been isolating himself. Those are all signs of paranoia. It could just be paranoia relative to, you know, the COVID situation and all that stuff. And you know what plays a part in paranoia is also being scared of your political opposition. I think it's very unlikely that Putin prepares properly a successor for himself, because when you have a successor, you also have someone who can actually lead a movement against you. So what's generally your opinion about the whole situation, since I haven't heard it? Do you believe that Russia is in the wrong, or do you at least understand why Russia is doing what it is, or do you believe it's simply wrong? I believe I both understand why Russia is doing it, but understanding is not condoning. I think it's important to understand why Russia is doing it, and there are several reasons for it, but I still think it's wrong. It's wrong from a moral perspective. It's wrong from an international law perspective. And honestly, I would even argue it's wrong in Russia's interests. The Kremlin has its reasons for doing this and thinks it's acting in Russia's interests. I full-heartedly believe that they do think they're acting in their own interests, but I don't think they are. They made several miscalculations, right? First off, they did not expect the scope of the sanctions that would be deployed against them. I think they expected they would be a much more half-hearted. They probably expected a situation like Georgia or Crimea, where, you know, we slap some sanctions on them, but it's more for PR than actual effectiveness against their economy. Secondly, don't believe they expected the amount of military support given to the Ukrainian army. It's very clear from the way they led the offensive in the early days, they actually expected to roll over Ukraine. They expected a blitzkrieg. They wanted to take Kyiv over in the course of like a week or two, and that failed. The plan A failed. Obviously, they had a plan B, which is what's happening right now. I don't know. I think both things can be true, basically. Just to elaborate, why they're wrong from the perspective of international law? Because of several reasons, right? Firstly, the Budapest Memorandum. Russia had actually committed to a contractual agreement to respect Ukraine's borders. Secondly, after the coup in 2014, even though the coup was technically anti-constitutional, the margin by which it was anti-constitutional is ridiculous. The circumstances were exceptional, of like borderline civil war. The government itself was not properly functioning as the government should be, so something had to be done. And finally, the takeover of Crimea, that the Kremlin justified by the idea that the naval base in Sevastopol was going to be taken over by the Ukrainian army because of the coup. I have seen no indication whatsoever that the post-2014 government was going to renege on the lease of the naval base to Russia in Sevastopol. So I've literally seen no justification that reason was actually salient. And finally, from moral perspective, Ukraine is not led by neo-Nazis, as well as Chinchilla is pointing out in the chat. The war in Donbass, which is indeed a humanitarian disaster, was fomented by Russia in the first place. If Russia hadn't been supporting and fomenting the independence movements, there would not be a humanitarian disaster in the first place. The language thing, the like banning Russian language thing that Ukraine did at some point, it's dumb, it sucks, I oppose it, but it doesn't justify a fucking civil war. And finally, Russia has clearly lost any sort of moral high ground in their war crimes and their actions in this war. A war of aggression where you go on to have massacres of civilians like in Busha, where you go on to have indiscriminate bombardment of civilian targets. I know, they're wrong on many fronts when it comes to those things for me.